Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 89th episode of the Truth Island podcast. If there is one thing that we can say with a certain degree of certainty, it's that life continues to move forward and become ever more increasingly complex. The world has not just grown complex in the fields of science and technology, but also within the realm of ideas. Many theories have emerged attempting to provide a coherent narrative to many of the thoughts or phenomena that we currently experience. Ideas such as capitalism, socialism, Christianity, Buddhism, etc., attempt to provide the subscriber with a series of all-encompassing answers which exist within a given framework of understanding. However, while each of these ideas may contain certain degrees of virtue, each system is not without its flaws. We as humans, to make sense of the world, often adapt labels so that we may conveniently bucket each of these complicated series of ideas into a digestible form that allows for an easier way of understanding the world. Labels, on one hand, allow us as humans to convey ideas and thoughts to one another without having to write a dissertation in doing so. However, as the world becomes more interconnected and complicated, many of these labels often become restrictive and binding. Take, for example, the word artist. Depending on the time and the context, this word can mean everything from being a skilled painter, musician, writer, or even an actor. However, the original meaning of this word once referred to someone of a skilled craft. At one point, the word artist even included practicing physicians. Given that labels vary so greatly, given the context and time in which they are used, one might ask, are they even necessary anymore? Labels might also force us as individuals to develop a certain degree of tribalism or apprehensiveness to new ideas, as once a label comes to intertwine itself with one's identity, it becomes increasingly difficult to denounce old ideas without removing a piece of oneself. Joining me to help understand what value labels might still play in our world, I am joined by Evan. Evan, tell me why I shouldn't just rip off all the labels on my cans of soup.
Well, because that's a great question, but and it's because you then you wouldn't know what you're eating.
That's so true.
Man, I love this. I love this. So I guess I should say I encountered your show, and I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you.
One of the things that I find very interesting about this program is there is I think there's a root assumption here about you've talked often I think about no man's land and about trying to stake out a dangerous middle ground. And I think that's a fascinating proposition. And it's one that at times I think I've taken issue with. And so, and you and I got to discuss it a little bit before here. And so I'm very glad that you brought me on here to expand on it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries.
One of the things I'm really hoping we get to talk about today is about this idea of do labels lock you in, or are labels limiting, or are labels in fact the engines which have driven society forward? Can you make progress without them? I'm going to argue today that you can't. I'm going to argue today that the idea of saying, well, I'm not this and I'm not that, and trying to stake out somewhere in the center is in fact harmful. And I'm going to try to make a case against centrism. And the 3 points I think that I'll try to make drive home the hardest, and there might be others, but I would argue that centrism doesn't make you independent. And I think lots of times centrists would like to consider themselves independent. And I don't think centrism accomplishes that. The second one I want to get into is that I don't think embracing an ideological position negates your curiosity or negates independent thought. And the third one I want to get into is that I don't know that it's possible to really make a difference as a centrist.
Okay, I want to start first off with the idea of being a centrist, right? And this idea that has been interpreted, well, the answer is always in the middle, right? It's the median. It's always the answer is always the median. And I actually think that sometimes extreme viewpoints of view are needed, okay? Like I actually am in agreement with you, and I wouldn't consider myself to be a centrist. However, I'm more of a pendulum. I vacillate quite a bit in my thought pattern, and that vacillation occurs depending on the context of what's going on around me. So I think that anyone who says, well, I'm just stuck in the middle, right? Because if we think about it, it's like, depending on how far first off, the middle changes over time, right? What's the middle today may not
Absolutely.
necessarily have been the middle 50 years ago, right? So I
Absolutely.
think to just stay, to dig your feet in the middle is probably not a good idea. But I think that a fair amount of exploration and pivoting is what's needed.
I don't disagree with that, but I think that there one of the problems with this idea of we should always keep exploring every single thing is it sort of negates this idea that we could ever answer a question. And certainly there are moral and philosophical and political questions to which we have found answers. Should we keep slaves? Should women be allowed to vote? Should gay people enjoy the benefits of marriage? These were all things that at various times, were controversial issues, and somebody pushing an answer to those questions would have been seen as a radical. And today we accept those as the bare minimum for participation in basic democratic society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important, that we should not be like uncovering regressive ideas or ideas that have been proven to be false. I do think that as humanity moves forward, what becomes gray and what becomes unknown changes. And that's where I kind of think that ideological positioning becomes a very dangerous area. When we look at the past, it's very easy to say, well, that was right or that was wrong,
Yep.
or that's on the wrong side of history. It's really impossible to do that with the present and future. It becomes really, really difficult to know just exactly what is the right answer moving forward. And that's where I think exploration is kind of a beautiful thing and a much needed thing.
This is where I think we're going to find some disagreement, because
Okay.
I think we are so far advanced in democracy, in society. We're 10,000 years into this experiment in civilization. And I think at this point in history, we have a really good backlog of lessons, a really good backlog that we can look into and say, okay, what was right then? And when they face similar problems to the problems we face, how did they find an answer, and what was the right answer there? I think and this is why I'm not ashamed to apply labels and take labels from the past and apply them to myself today, is because they were right, right? The abolitionists were right, and the women's suffragists were right. And so when we face similar problems today, we say, how should we answer this? I think it's helpful and maybe even necessary to look at the past and to wrap ourselves in those intellectual traditions from the past and carry them forward and keep moving on them.
Now, we spoke originally offline about the idea of being like an abolitionist or a
Mhm.
suffragist. And, we're in agreement that the, abolishing of slavery is a wondrous thing, like where there's absolutely no doubt about it. But one thing I kind of wanted to dig into is like when someone called themselves, let's say, an abolitionist during that time period, that label also came with a lot of packaging, right? And the abolitionists, as you probably know, were a part of like a group called the Radical Republicans, and they may have had stances on tariffs and states' rights and all this other stuff that kind of got downloaded with the idea of being an abolitionist, which we both agree is a very, wondrous thing. I'm wondering if we, let's say we rewind the clock and we're in the year, 1855, and slavery is still on the table. What is so wrong, Evan, with just being like, hey, from a moral perspective, I see that abolishing slavery is a wondrous thing. I can totally get on board with that. Why do I necessarily have to take the label of everything else that might come with that? Because something like tariffs might actually fluctuate. Sometimes having high tariffs is positive, and then and other times it's really negative to have high tariffs. So I'm wondering why we always have to take, I think with labels, we sometimes have to take other parts of that package that we don't necessarily agree with or may not be right for all eternity.
This is a great question, but I think we're confusing some of these labels here. So I think when we're talking about something like abolition or suffrage or one of these, we're talking about something with a very clear goal, a very thing that right, you can draw a line in the sand and it's very easy to understand. Do you support the abolition of slavery or do you not? Political parties, I think, even though they do make ideological cases in a lot of times, and even that's kind of a new development. That's there are still places in the world where you go and political parties are still just kind of patronage networks and not exactly ideological. But in America, we do have this ideological tradition that the parties somewhat adhere to. But political parties, I would not make the case that those are the sort of line in the sand sort of things. They are right. They are alliances, strategic alliances between people with different goals, different political and economic and social goals, and these sorts of things. So I would say I would have that same problem you're having. I would say, why do I have to have a stance on tariffs to be an abolitionist? I would say you don't have to, right? I would say, and today there are people who prison abolition is probably a nice continuation of that movement, and I'm sure there are prison abolitionists who have differing views on taxes and all sorts of other issues. But on the issue of prison abolition, people have a pretty it's a pretty clear goal.
Right. So I want to, like, thinking about even the slavery abolitionist movement, the abolitionists were not a single monolith. For example, there were some abolitionists who thought, let's just end slavery, but that's it. No equal rights, just slavery is over, but there's still going to be segregation. Blacks are not equal to whites. So there was that type of abolitionist. And then I think there was another type of abolitionist who thought full equality across the board. And this is where even if you call yourself under the label of an abolitionist, there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of grayness, and there's a lot of details that need to be parsed out. And that's why the word abolitionist in itself can be very confusing, because it's like, well, what type of abolitionist are you? And I think if we fast forward and use the prison abolitionist kind of model, right? Those same questions begin to emerge. Well, what kind of prison abolitionist are you? Do you believe that someone can murder another person and walk free? Are you that extreme that there should be zero prisons? Do you think that our prisons should be more rehabilitative and follow the Nordic model kind of prison abolition? So even when you call yourself a prison abolitionist, that begets 1,001 questions as to what exactly you mean by that label.
There is some truth to that, absolutely. But I think that's one of the things. You're getting into my second point for me, so thank you. Which is that applying a label to yourself or putting your own actions in concert with a movement does not negate independence or curiosity, right? Because you might have to answer those questions you're talking about right now. The last movie I saw in theaters before the theaters shut down was Little Women. And so I was reading about afterwards. I was reading about Louisa May Alcott because I wasn't that familiar with her, and I was reading about her father, who was an abolitionist and who was, I think, maybe a Quaker, perhaps. This was back in March or February.
Yeah, Quakers were very good, right? They were very awesome.
but he was ostracized from his community because just as you're saying, he wanted to educate his children alongside free blacks, and his community said, "Oh no, that's too far. That's too far." And they tried to stake out a position that was not so far. And now in with the benefit of hindsight, we can very easily say, oh well, that was wrong. They were absolutely wrong about that. And so that's what I talk about. I talk about what can we learn from history and what can we learn from from people who also donned the labels of intellectual traditions that we want to continue. When I look at that, the lesson that I take is, these arbitrary lines in the sand are just that.
But, if let's just say that we were to implement something like prison abolition, right? We would really have to ask those difficult questions of like, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean that we focus more on rehab, or do you literally mean there's no more prisons? And then, like, this is where I think that we should just be focusing on the idea itself, and we should be very precise in our language. And this is kind of where I think labels fall into a danger, because let's say I identify as a prison abolitionist, right? Well, now that label is not highly precise. And because that label is not highly precise, one, it makes me extremely vulnerable to attack, because then people are going to be like, oh, well, you believe that criminals should just run wild, right? And it actually hurts your cause in a way, because if you just say, I'm a prison abolitionist, without actually specifying the details as to what you mean, people are going to start attacking you and be like, well, what does the world look like? Whereas if you actually remove that label and say, hey, I believe that prisons need to be reformed and have a blah, blah, blah model of rehabilitation and so forth, I think that actually invites discourse and it actually invites dialogue. Whereas if you just go with, I'm a prison abolitionist, you're going to get attacked, because people aren't going to necessarily, one, take the time to understand what you mean, and two, you may not even have taken the time to understand what you mean by that.
So I disagree there.
Okay.
because in the one, I don't think whether you say I'm a prison abolitionist or whether you say I'm a person who questions whether or not we need prisons, right? Whether you apply the label or not, you can still have a conversation with somebody, right? You can still, somebody says, well, what is a prison abolition? What does that mean? What does that look like? And you still get to flesh out your position, and just as you could if you go the other route. But the difference between them, the reason why it's stronger to adopt the thing and more necessary, is that without label, without committing yourself to the goal to the point that you are willing to call yourself that, you don't really have the ability to make change. You don't really have the ability to affect the outcome. And I'll give you an example. Dr. King made his name as an anti-racist. He was perhaps the greatest anti-racist activist that the world will ever see. At the end of his career, he started going into anti-imperialism, and he tried to tie his anti-racist work to anti-imperialism, and that was controversial, right? A lot of people in his anti-racist movement opposed that addition. With the benefit of hindsight, a lot of people who remain active in anti-racism today have since embraced anti-imperialism as well, right? And there's a huge overlap now between anti-racism and anti-imperialism. That's due to King, right? Not exclusively due to King, but it wouldn't have happened, or would have happened much slower without King. That can only happen because King had his bona fides, right? As an anti-racist. If King had sat on the sidelines and shouted to the people marching past him on the street saying, we should also fight anti-imperialism, nobody would have cared. Nobody would have cared, and nor should they. That's not how change happens.
Now I hear what you're saying, but I think when Dr. King was speaking about imperialism, he was specifically referring to the Vietnam War. And I think that in that instance, I'm sure he gave wonderful reasons as to why the Vietnam War was a huge mistake. He didn't just necessarily give a blanket statement of like, I'm anti-imperialism. He actually gave like a long list as to why the conflict in Vietnam was a huge disaster, which is awesome. I think that's a great thing to do. And I think that's how you change people's mind. But I think that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of long drawn out discussions. And I don't know, because if Dr. King had been, pro civil rights, and then he just offhandedly said, oh, I'm also anti-imperialist,
Mhm.
FYI, and just walked away and did not really explain each of those bullets very thoroughly, well, that would have led to a lot of confusion. So I think that what's better than just having a label of being anti-imperialist is picking a specific example and then specifically explaining why that thing is wrong and how it needs to be changed.
I don't think that applying a label negates that, though, right? I don't think, if you want to talk about, I guess, the tactical ways of messaging, I could see that. It's saying, oh, some people are turned off by this word or that word. I could see that. But I don't think that including that contextualizing your position in an intellectual tradition that stretches back, however far, or one that's just being born. I don't think that negates you doing exactly what you're describing. I don't think King would say, I'm an anti-imperialist and I'm not going to say another word on the subject, and I won't tell you why Vietnam's a bad idea. I think the two are mutual.
Well, let me give you an example of someone else who used a label for most of their life, and that person was actually Albert Einstein,
Mhm.
and he called himself a pacifist. This was the label that he loved. He said, and and bear in mind, Einstein's coming up in Germany after World War I. He's
Mhm.
seen all sorts of crazy stuff, and he used the word pacifist. I'm a pacifist, and he said, Einstein actually, hated political parties and did not like getting involved in politics. But the one certainty that he thought that he had was pacifism, that all wars could be avoided, no doubt. However, when he had to flee from Germany, and then his, childhood home and all this other stuff was completely ransacked by the Nazis and so forth, even he was like, man, there's no label in this world that's 100% certain. Like I thought I could call myself a pacifist, but then the Nazis came and they totally showed me otherwise. So that's kind of where I get scared with any type of label, because there'll always be some type of future occurrence that's unknown or unforeseen to you that might just take that label and turn it upside down.
Uh, Interesting. I mean, listen, an ideology is a way of ordering facts about the world to tell a narrative, right? To tell a coherent story. And the world does not like, you're right, being contained. It does not like being put in an order, and when you try to order it, it does fight that. And I think any ideology, probably grown, as it gets a kind of mission creep to it, it's going to produce these kinds of contradictions. Sure. but I don't think that but again, that's something I think when we're talking about the levels of a political party or a religion, right? These things that are not necessarily an ideology, but more these sorts of tactical alliances or social forces unto themselves. I don't see the kinds of contradictions that abolition or women's suffrage could produce, right? I don't see that happening. Pacifism, I understand the problem there. Einstein also was proud to call himself a socialist, and that's one that can produce its own sorts of contradictions too. But I don't know that he shied away from that.
I mean, like if we were having this podcast, let's say in the 1920s or 30s,
Mhm.
it would be very tempting to be like, come, Aaron, you saw World War I, right? You saw what a disaster that was. Like guys lost their legs and all of this. Isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious that pacifism is the way forward? And it would kind of look like that, wouldn't it? It would really, really look like that. But that's why I always like to have I don't ever want to fully give myself to anything because I always like that little room, that little margin of error for skepticism. And I think that really, if there's one thing I figured out about us humans is that we've got to be very adaptable. Like this world is changing very quickly and things happen very rapidly. And even if you're kind of dragging your foot for just a second too long, it might be a second too late. And that's why I think that when you don't have these labels, you can really respond a lot quicker to what's going on around you. I think a label causes a more delayed reaction because if you were carrying the pacifism label, well, then that's kind of delaying your reaction time to what's going on around you. So I think that labels carry the danger of making you slower in some way.
It's interesting, but it's also it also kind of gets back to some of the things we've talked about already in this. So if you are a pacifist, if you hold yourself to be a pacifist, if that's a belief that is dear to you, right, then it's not something that should be abandoned, right? If and I'm not weighing in on Einstein and World War II. I'm just talking in the abstract here. That if you're not a pacifist when it's difficult to be a pacifist, then you're probably not really a pacifist. And for me, I don't know that the keeping the label of an intellectual tradition slows reaction time. If anything, I think it informs it and could make it faster. There's so much there is so much that has precedent in history. You and I have lived through an incredible communications revolution that has upended political systems and ideologies and relationships and marriages and all these sorts of things. And it's easy for us to say, "Wow, like that's a new one," but there are precedents for this, right? What happened with the Gutenberg printing press, in some ways, is the forebear, caused kind of the similar disruptions to what you and I have seen these last 15 years now. So I don't know. So I don't know that there is any harm. If, in fact, I think there's great gain to saying I'm a secular humanist in that sort of situation, saying I took the lessons that from Gutenberg and I took the lessons from the last time society was disrupted this way, and I have ordered those facts into a way that tells a coherent story about the world, and I'm going to take those lessons and apply those to my present situation. And I don't know, certainly there's nothing, you don't have to call yourself a secular humanist to pick up a book and read about secular humanism and do these sorts of things. But I don't know that there's any harm in learning from history and saying, yeah, there was a right answer back then, and I'm gonna keep those lessons and embrace them.
Oh man, well, let me just say, you would actually love the series I do on this show about the Roman Empire because that's all me and my Roman Empire expert Brett do is we look at Rome and be like, that's just like the U.S. and we go back and forth and back and forth, and it's really helpful. And I think there's great value in what you're saying about looking at history and
Yeah.
making these comparisons. However, I never dive in hook, line, and sinker and say, yes, like this is predictive. Like I think that's like we can learn from history and take lessons and be like, well, this is similar, this is like this has semblance of this, and this is what happens here. But I'm never going to just completely be like, well, with 100% certainty, it will work out this way because it's just like what happened in Rome. And I think that presents as danger when we look at history and say, well, this event in the future is identical because no two data points in history are identical. Similar comparisons Hey, I mean, I'm with you there, man. I love talking to historians, but that's where I kind of say, if no two data points in history are identical to one another, then we always have to be using the noggin and constantly reevaluating the playing field at every given moment. And I would say this happens not just even on a year. This happens on a daily basis. Like, we have to reassess what we're doing on a daily, hour by hour moment of what we think is the right thing to do. And this comes down to a philosophical idea of like what is right or what is correct. And I do think that there are viewpoints which are correct, but that varies almost on a daily, yearly basis based on the new information that's kind of coming in.
Let me ask you this, because this is something I've been trying to puzzle over. But you have beliefs, you have moral beliefs and political beliefs and ethical beliefs. Are you able to take action on those beliefs? Can you march? Talk to me about this?
Absolutely. I think that I can take action based on my beliefs. However, one of the premises I talk about in the early versions of the show is the idea of virtue. And virtue is like the highest. These are your principles. These are the things that kind of govern. This comes back to the ideas of Plato. And for Plato, he believes that the highest virtue of a society is justice. So everything that you do in this world has to reflect justice. So you could say that, oh, justice is my highest virtue. For other people, it might be compassion. So everyone has their own sense of what their highest virtue is. What justice looks like varies depending on information. So we might think that, if we were living in Hammurabi's time, an eye for an eye, well, that's justice, right? We're taking Plato's concept of justice, and you poke out my eye, and now I poke out your eye. However, as we evolve and as our knowledge increases, our concept of justice or an application of justice begins to change over time. So my idea is that I have virtues that I can act upon. I'm not one of these philosophers that just sits and drinks tea and says, oh, away with the world. Like, I don't just look out my window with scorn and like be like, oh, the plebeians down there, they don't know. No, I'm not one of those ivory tower kind of guys. I do think that we have a commitment to action, but I think it requires a lot of work, and it requires a lot of serious dialogue, and it requires a lot of soul searching. And, I categorize myself as a philosopher, and philosophers get a really bad rap as being extremely lazy and not doing anything, right? Like, that's the classic stereotype of a philosopher, is you're lazy. And I'm like, no, 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 no. We do move. Philosophers do move and do take action, but we like to talk about things at a very deep level and make sure that what it is that we are fighting for is absolutely true for that moment. And when new information comes in, we might pivot our strategy depending on the way new information takes us.
So that's a good answer. So can you take action in concert with other people? If other people, other philosophers, let's say, all come to the same conclusion, maybe not all, that'll never happen, but if enough of them come to the same conclusion, guys say, okay, let's do this. We're all going to take action to demand X, Y, or Z. Can you do that? Can you take action as a group? And as a group, can you give that movement a name? Can you put an ism on the end of it?
I did discuss this on a previous episode, and I discussed this with my colleague Claire, and we said the best thing to do is to form alliances, not necessarily coalitions, but alliances. And the best comparison that we came up with was World War II, the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States to defeat Germany. Mm-hmm. Now, in an alliance system, Evan, the US does not become more like the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union does not become more like the US. They don't adapt, each other's ideology. They don't mix or whatever. They have their core tenets, their core virtues and principles, but then they act in concert with one another to defeat a greater evil. So in my system, if there's a cause that I'm really liking and there's a cause that I feel is truthful, I may form an alliance with people who are of that similar cause. But I am not going to basically allow my identity to become diluted by working with those people. We may have an exchange of ideas, and they might prove things to me, and I might change my mind. Like, hey, you've changed my mind, sir. Awesome. I now think of the world this way, and so forth. However, I think in these alliance systems, it's important to maintain your core principles and virtues on other issues that you may have formulated, but then you can work with other people on resolving that one specific task.
Oh, I disagree completely, man. Respectfully,
Okay, man.
I
No, go ahead.
completely disagree here. So I think okay. So for one, okay, just to go with this analogy, the only reason this analogy is popular or is possible, the only reason that you can talk about a military alliance between states is because we have states and militaries, right? And we had these entities exist, and the only reason these entities exist is because we have people who were statists, and we have people who were abolitionists, and we have people who were socialists, and we have these people who committed themselves to movements, who acted in concert with other people, and they created the United States and the Soviet Union, and they created Germany, and they created militaries, and they created all these things. These wouldn't exist if people on an individual level had held the rules that I think you're proposing. And another thing, this idea that by committing myself to a movement or to a label that's shared by other people, that I'm somehow sullying my individual intellect, I think is way off the mark. If anything, so much of the things that we love about the world have been produced by people who were acting in concert towards a shared goal. I just think about the songs the spiritual songs that were sung on the Underground Railroad, or chants and march. Some of the chants that we hear today at protests, have long histories through the civil rights era, and that's not nobody was sullied, I think, by chanting the same thing and by creating these songs to sing with people, marching up the or any of these, right? I think no, I think by acting in concert with people and by committing ourselves to the same goals and shared struggles, I think that's when we can create something really beautiful, something that we might even call culture. Yeah.
I think, look, there's nothing, again, like I agree with you with the working in concert, but like, to use another analogy, let's just take a look at, the American Revolution, for example. Okay.
Mhm.
All of the founding fathers are acting in concert to defeat Great Britain and to form the United States, right? So they're in agreement, and they're coming up with wonderful catchphrases, and they're, sort of they're in arms with one another. But then, revolution ends, and now you all of a sudden have the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, and they're going at each other. So that's like an example where, okay, we're putting our differences aside and forming a common alliance. But once this alliance has once the purpose of that alliance is no more, I'm going to kind of sulk back into my original ideas. Now, you have every right to argue with me and convince me otherwise, and I'm totally capable of changing. However, we're not going to just, mesh completely into something that is, that hasn't been proven to be 100% fully true at that point. It's like one step at a time. It's like we form this alliance. If you want more from me, if you want to drag me to the next step, you got to convince me. You got to put in the hard work. You got to write the Federalist Papers. You got to have these meaningful exchanges to get me to the next level. It's not going to just kind of organically happen through osmosis.
Well, what's funny? So I'm loath to apply any of my arguments to political parties or religions, right? Because I think that scale is just too big, and I think there's too much going on there. It ceases to be about ideology at that point. But that said, I still think it's interesting that even the one you're describing, right, where they did exactly that, where they said, okay, our alliance is over, and so now it's every man for himself. Even then, that government failed, right? The first government of this country, which ascribed to the rules that you are describing, did not work, and they had to rewrite the whole damn thing. So I think that I don't know. I'm not going to apply it to politics, or at least to parties, but it's funny to me that even then it doesn't work. I don't know, man. I think there's something to this.
I mean, if we think about, I think you're referring to like the Articles of Confederation, right? Mm-hmm. So like they formed the Articles of Confederation. So that's an example of like the greater enemy right now is Great Britain, right? Like so that's mm-hmm. like the operating system of like, that is the greater enemy. Once greater enemy has been defeated, well, it seems that this makeshift, what we call, let's say, a constitution written on a napkin, right? That's what the Article of Confederation was. It was just like, like, this will be the interim thing. And then And then what's important, though, is I think in the aftermath of the revolution, that those important discussions about states' rights and federalism and anti-federalism, it's kind of, and the idea of a national bank, it's kind of good that we went through all of these growing pains, right? I think the growing pains is positive, because there could have been like, all right, let's just adopt a federal, like the federal system. Let's not think twice about it. But the arguing, Evan, is what makes things work. It's all of the debates, it's all of the dissent, it's all of the pain, it's all of the like 3-hour NPR broadcasts that actually make things work, because life is just so complicated that, and I try and tell people this on this podcast all the time, no issue is going to be solved by a meme. Nothing in this world is going to be solved by a meme. Everything is going to be exhausting and taxing. And that's just the game of life. And that's why I think it's so important to not just fall into labels and like be like, yes, I am, a prison abolitionist or whatever. I'm like, what does that mean? You can't solve it that easily. It takes a lot of work, and you got to put it in, my friend.
I mean, I agree with you. I just don't think that I wish it was the case that somebody could get up, I could get up and say, I'm a prison abolitionist, and just wipe my hands and be like, well, that settles that. I wish that was it. But the truth is, and this is something that is so true, I think, of any sort of leftist movement, right? But go to any leftist meeting on any issue, and you're going to hear arguments, right? You're going to hear, I wish that people could we could just get unified and just okay, that's it, guys. No more meeting. I'll see you guys at the rally, at the protest, and then we'll just keep doing that, and then day is done. But no, the left is consumed by infighting on literally every issue. I read an account of activists in the 80s, I think, who successfully banned nuclear power, right, in the US. We haven't had a new nuclear power plant built in I think, since you and I were kids. And I read an account and this isn't, I know people feel differently about nuclear power today, and I'm not getting into that one right now. But what I thought was fascinating about their account of it was they were trying to organize one of these things that has a very clear line in the sand goal. But even then, they said their meetings it was impossible to get anything done, because people would get up and they say, we're not going to be able to do this until we defeat patriarchy. We're not going to be able to do this until we defeat X, Y, or Z. And the left is fractious, right? And even when you draw a very simple goal, it's fractious and they're fractious. Excuse me. And so it's and I'm not. This isn't to knock intersectionality. I think one of the better things about our time is we're finally understanding at a broad scale how all these things fit together and feed into each other. I think that's wonderful. I just know that it's if what you're saying is that, by putting a label on yourself, you're committing yourself to the end of thinking and the end of debate and the end of all this stuff, I don't see that. I almost wish that were the case.
Like let's take the idea of like, eliminating nuclear energy or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think if someone just said, I want to abolish nuclear energy, then someone else would come and have a thought, well, how about in this context? What if this nuclear plant over here is environmentally safe and so forth, right? Whereas you set your original proposition, your original statement, or your original label was, I want to abolish nuclear energy.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we find out is that after 3 hours, it's like, oh, wait a minute, you don't really want to abolish nuclear energy. You just want nuclear energy to operate in this very safe environmental way. And that's kind of where it's like, it's creating like an unneeded tension. If you look at the titles of all my episodes, I always ask them usually in the form of a question, like, what is the correct balance, or how do we do this? And I feel like when I use words like how or why or the correct balance, it always invites the possibility that I'm wrong. It always invites the possibility that the most extreme version of that solution is not necessarily the correct solution, and so forth. Whereas the label usually implies the absolute, the most extreme version of that solution. Nuclear, getting rid of nuclear energy. That's a very extreme concept. So I think that when we kind of abandon the labels and we kind of just phrase all of these questions as hows and whys and ifs and so's and how much, now we actually get to like something that's closer to the truth. And I think that a lot of people like labels is because they sound really sexy. Like I think people love labels because they're sexy as hell, and I get that. But I'm making the argument that sometimes you don't want to be the sexy girl. Sometimes you want to be the girl that reads a lot of books and like is going to talk about things for hours and hours and hours.
Well, if people who labeled themselves didn't talk for hours and hours and hours, that'd be something. But that's never been my experience either. I don't think I. I don't think, well, I don't know if labels are sexy. Maybe they're sexy. Some are sexy. I don't know if they're all sexy. But even if they are sexy, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as they include what you're discussing, right? Research and debate and these sorts of things, which I don't think they preclude. And I don't think that there's anything in labels. And I should say nuclear energy is different than most of the ones we've been discussing otherwise, right? Because nuclear, there's science in there, there's logistics in there. That's not the case with abolition. That's not the case with women voting, right? Those are the sorts of labels that I think that I don't think we should have any issue donning. I get nuclear energy. A lot of people are just going to say, I'm not a nuclear scientist. And that's right. That's fine. That's a separate thing than what we're discussing. So, but I don't see I don't see labels as an impediment to debate. If they're sexy, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good way to get people to understand their own actions as part of a larger whole, which is the only way that we ever create change at the kind of levels that we need it to happen at.
I think but that sexiness, comes at the cost of misunderstanding, and I think that's one of the penalties you pay. Now, I might just be an odd bird, but if I saw two guys, one guy's like, I'm prison abolition, and then another guy was like, I believe in a series of reforms to correct the prison system in America, I would actually listen to the latter guy who's has a long little speech to give on how he thinks that prisons should be reformed, because I feel like that person is putting in the work in actually figuring out what exactly is wrong, what exactly needs to be fixed, and it could swing, it could go back. Whereas I think the person who outwardly says, I wish that prisons are abolished, there might be a deeper thesis behind what they're saying. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But you've basically you've kind of used a false label, and the false label is that prisons should be abolished, right? And that's a very striking, a very like firework. It's like a firework going up in the sky. It captures your attention, good or bad, right? Like good or bad, it captures people's intention. But then when you actually talk to them, you're like, well, that's not really what you meant. That's that your label and what you're actually saying are kind of in disagreement with one another. And I tend not to trust those people as much, because they kind of use the firework to get my attention and be like, look how outrageous, look how sexy my label is. And then I actually talk with them and I'm like, well, your label and your core principles over here are not really in agreement. And that at least makes, I think that person's kind of using a form of deception. They're using a label to get my attention, and then the underlying tenets of what they believe in kind of contradict the label itself.
Well, but we're talking about a hypothetical argument here, right? There's an assumption in here that you think a prison abolitionist is going to say, I'm a prison abolitionist, and then detail something besides that, or won't detail something at all. Somebody could very easily say, I'm a prison abolitionist, and here are all the reasons why, and here are all the reasons why society would be better if we did anything but this, right? But I'm really curious. I mean, how would this have worked in 1850? Right, where you had somebody, where we find ourselves very similar. There were people who said, don't end slavery, reform it. Fewer whippings or things like that. And there, ultimately, we found that they were wrong. Right, they launched great op-eds, I'm sure, in the New York Times. They detailed things. I just read an op-ed from when in the New York Times from when Lincoln got elected, and they said as soon as Lincoln gets into office, he needs to put aside these abolitionists. Right? They said they are taking things too far. They are really hindering change. He really needs to just break with these abolitionists. Like, so talk to me about how this would have worked in 1850, where you have somebody who says abolish slavery, and then you have some people who are enumerating ways that you can moderate or reform slavery.
I think one of the and I want to give abolitionists a huge credit, is that abolitionists meant exactly what they meant, right? Like if you talk to an abolitionist and said, what do you mean by abolish slavery? They were like, just as it says, just as you're hearing. And I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. If I talk to, let's say, a prison abolitionist, then I kind of get like an explanation about, oh, well, the prison system needs to be, rehabilitated and so forth. They don't literally mean like a killer is going to just like, if I kill somebody, there's no consequences and then I'm able to walk free. In most prison abolitionist circles, there is some kind of, they can call it something else. They may not call it a prison. There is some kind of apparatus that confines the individual's liberties after they have committed a crime. Maybe it's a more humanitarian apparatus. So I would say that it's not exactly what it is that they mean. That's where I kind of get a little upset with this.
But we could have kneecapped the slavery abolitionists the same way, right? We could have said, all right, fine, abolish slavery, but then who's going to work the farms? And they'll say, well, the people who will work the farms, they'll just be paid to do it. And then we would have said, oh, but what about farms that don't make a lot of money? They won't be able to pay these guys a lot of money. They'll only pay them a little money. And be like, all right, then I guess, pay them what they need to survive. We'll be like, isn't that just like slavery? Right. And it's not, right. It's not great, but it's not slavery. And so we could kneecap anybody's argument by saying, like, oh, if you can't, if you have to explain it in more than two sentences, somehow you're not the thing you say. But I don't think that's the case, right?
I mean, like even with slavery, right? Like I think slavery was succeeded by the sharecropping system,
course,
which
yeah.
was just, very also a horrendous, really bad, horrendous system. And this is where, saying what you mean and having a very detailed plan about what you mean really comes in handy, because you want to avoid the next sharecropping system. That's kind of where you want to talk with the prison abolitionist and be like, what exactly is it that you mean? And if you believe that prisons should function more in the Nordic model or more in a rehabilitative thing, then why not just call yourself, I'm a prison rehabilitationist, or I'm a prison reformer, or use language that isn't quite as extreme but more encompassing of the thoughts that you're actually trying to articulate. And I think that that's helpful to do. Or it could just be that you walk up to somebody and say, here's how I think prisons should be changed, or here's what I think we should do with criminals. I think that those kind of conversations bear much more fruit than the most extreme version of like prison should be abolished, and then a whole argument ensues, and then we untangle what exactly that means. I think just starting off from the bat and saying, hey, here's how I think prison should be changed, it's a much more fruitful conversation and much more true of what it is that you're trying to get at.
Right, but I don't think anyone's trying to argue that sharecropping is the fault of the abolitionists.
No.
Right? Like, so I don't get why. I don't get. I guess I'm lost here. Like, why would what comes after prisons be the fault of prison abolitionists? Why? No, if anything, and again, we're assuming that people working towards a single goal don't have, that they either, on the one hand, you're faulting them for trying to sum it up in one sentence, and then on the other, you're saying if they have to explain it somehow, they're negating their proposition.
Okay, let me explain. Let's say tomorrow, Sing Sing, Rikers, all the prisons were closed.
Sure.
All of them were closed down. What next? That would be the question on everybody's mind. That's why they have to explain what exactly it means by prison abolition. Because if tomorrow, if we literally took them at their word, if I was just following the label without sniffing any further, abolish prison, we close down Sing Sing, close down Rikers, close down all of these prisons, what to do with some of these folk? Maybe some of them we could just let free and everything would be fine. Others, probably not so.
Sure.
So that's why I'm demanding more beyond beyond the label, basically.
Sure, but I mean, prison abolitionists have answers to that, right? That people have written books on this. This is a huge intellectual thing. The fact that people have answers to this question doesn't make them any less a prison abolitionist, right? So I guess I'm maybe I've lost the thread here, but I know you wanted to talk about the evolution of labels over time, and we haven't gotten a chance to do that yet.
Yeah. I mean, I almost feel like this is like a second part over here. Yeah, and all, a lot of labels change over time. So we could call ourselves something in one decade, and it slowly means Something else in another decade, like, any of these words like capitalism, like law, like, for example, if we use the word capitalism, right? Well, that, laissez-faire capitalism was a lot different in the 19th century than it was in the 20th century, and then
Mhm.
in the 21st century. And the same thing, same evolutionary growth applies to socialism as well, right? I think
A lot,
all
a
of
lot of
these,
the things that we consider capitalist today are that we consider these things the bare minimum of a capitalist economy that would have been socialist to our grandparents and our great grandparents. Yeah.
so there's evolution in all of these ideas, in all of these forms, and that's why I kind of, and they're also very like contingent on the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves entrenched in. Like our viewpoints change. There might be times where we need higher taxation. Sometimes we lower taxes. The interest rate change. All of these things
Mhm.
fluctuate so greatly, and what you really want, when you're discussing these issues, and what you really want in a leader who's sitting at the helm, is to be able to be very responsive. Like, you want somebody that's very responsive. And I think of someone like Hoover, and Hoover may have called himself a capitalist or whatever, right? But was he a very responsive person? Probably not. And that's why he got, nicknamed all these, like, Dust Bowl towns got named Hoovervilles, right? Because
Yep.
he wasn't a fundamentally responsive guy. He was like, I'm a capitalist. I'm not fluctuating with the times, and that's just my core ideology. And he went to bed with that. And then FDR comes in, and he's more responsive. And it could be in the reverse as well. There might be someone who has ultra, kind of socialist policies in place, and it's like, all right, maybe we need the free market to maybe we need some more neoliberalism or some more free market policies to come in there. And I think that labels limit your responsiveness, right? And especially if that label is harkening back to a previous time period.
I don't agree, but I also don't want to discuss at the levels of implementing economic policy in the highest office of the world. That's right. That I think is a little bit of a different scale than what we're talking about, which is, what do I do with my own actions, and what do I do with my own labor, and how do I create the changes I want to see in the world. But it is interesting. I remember when the whole global economy crashed under Bush, and he signed a bailout bill for trillions of dollars, and he kept saying, as he signed it, he kept saying, "Well, I'm a capitalist. This is really, I'm a free market capitalist, and this goes against my beliefs, but I'm doing what's right for the country," and these sorts of things. I don't know. Sure, in that situation, an ideologue somebody could be so ideological that they would never sign that sort of thing. But I don't know. I'm not so worried about the ways that our labels and our ideologies apply to an institution that has there's probably no institution in the world that has more pressure on it from more sides than the American presidency, right? That's a whole different sort of thing. I'm not the American president, and so I'm trying to figure out what should I do with my labor, and how should I bring the change that I want to see into the world. And for me, that answer is to align it with people who want to achieve the same goals. And if the best way to do that is to put a label on it, I'm all for it. Yeah.
But again, like I said, I think, in times of emergencies, right, and in times of like when we have to really act, right, it gives you that agency and that flexibility. And if let's just say that you really want change in this world, right, and
Mhm.
I can see that, man. Like, I know that what you're saying is coming from an awesome, great place. Like, I
Mhm.
don't doubt that at all. I'm wondering though, Evan, if you just, if you believe in one thing though, right, what is so wrong with just creating the malleability and creating that space to be like, hey, I thought I really wanted to achieve this thing in this direction, but I just spoke with this other person, and now they've kind of moved me and shifted me away from this ideology, and now I'm kind of leaning a little bit more over here. I think when you have that label, and this is kind of the last point that I have for us here, is you tend to see your identity within that label, and you tend to take up the tribal identity, and you kind of tend to ascribe some of that label to your personal identity in such way. And I think this happens a lot in politics today. If someone calls himself a socialist, and then they get into an argument with somebody, they might end up defending things that they actually, that they know at some level are kind of wrong, but because they have the label, they've got to defend the whole packaging. They got to defend the whole fort and everything that comes within the fort, even if they personally don't agree with everything. Whereas if you just say, hey, I'm Evan, and I think this is a good idea, and then someone talks with you and says, okay, I think half of your idea is good, and you're like, oh great, half my idea is good, and we kind of get in that level. I think you're going to be a much stronger Evan by just having your ideas, but then realizing that as soon as one of these ideas is proven wrong, I'm going to abandon it. I think the label prevents a lot of people from just discarding their ideas very quickly, because when they do that, they feel like they're losing a part of themselves.
I'll try to wrap it up too. I think there is potential for everybody to be an ideologue, and I think especially that potential grows when we talk about more complete systems like a political party or a religion. And I think you and I have probably both met people who defend things that they shouldn't defend in the name of one of those huge alliances, right? But I don't think that potential is minimized, I think, by rejecting labels either, right? Centrism too is its own kind of ideology, right? Centrism is its own ideology about who can be right and who can be wrong, and what things are facts, right? What are the facts of history? What are the lessons we should take? Centrism is also its own kind of ideology, and I would worry that that all the things that you're saying, if they are true, right, could also be true of centrism as well.
Again, I'm not a centrist here.
Yeah.
I have points of view that someone would be like, whoa, that's a really conservative thought, Aaron. And then I have other points of view that some people would be like, whoa, you're left. I always joke around with people that, the conservatives think I'm too liberal and the liberals think I'm too, and I'm like, I'm not trying to just stick to the middle lane. I'm not just trying to be the middle lane here. It's my points of view are more of a like ink blot painting. They're just scattered all over the place, and over time these dots move. Like the dots don't stay static. They're just constantly moving around and so forth. So I think if you're a centrist, you're again, like we started this discussion off, you're basically putting your boots in the middle. It's some imaginary median, right? Whereas I'm just saying, be an open canvas, and your dots move around depending on where new information and depending on where context takes you.
I like that sentiment a lot. I don't think it's ruled out by labels, but I do like that sentiment a lot.
All right. Evan, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hey, thank you for having me, man. This was a pleasure.
This concludes the 89th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.